I still remember the first moment more clearly than anything that came after. Not the panic, not the running, just that quiet second when nothing was supposed to be wrong. The air was colder than I expected, cold in a way that felt thin, like all the warmth had been drained out of the trees before I even reached the door. I stood there for a long breath, staring at the cabin. The boards were gray and bowed, the kind that gets soft after decades of weather. The roofline sagged a little. Everything looked tired, forgotten, and perfectly still. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. It stuck for half a second before giving way, scraping across the floor with a low, dry sound. Dust lifted in slow swirls, drifting through the last bit of daylight leaking in from behind me. The place smelled like closed-up wood and damp paper, old but harmless. I didn't feel anything strange, no chill running down my spine, no sense of being watched, just that usual hesitation you get when you walk into a place that hasn't been touched in years. Quiet, dead quiet. My footsteps sounded too loud, so I slowed down without thinking. A narrow window sat on the left wall, its glass coated with a soft layer of grime. On the ledge beneath it, something caught a tiny sliver of light, a small brass bell, simple, round, about the size of a walnut. It was the only thing in the cabin that wasn't dull or faded. Clean metal, no dust on it at all. I frowned a little but didn't think much of it. Cabins collect junk. People leave things. It happens. I set my pack down near the doorway, letting the straps fall with a soft thud. For maybe 2 seconds, 3 at most, I looked away to pull off my gloves and stretch my hands. When I turned my head back toward the window, the bell wasn't in the exact same spot. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't rolled. It hadn't tipped over. It had shifted, just a few inches to the right. Nothing dramatic. The kind of movement you could easily blame on a trick of the eyes. I narrowed my eyes at it, trying to replay the last few seconds in my head. Had I bumped something? Did the floor shake? Did the bell actually start out where I thought it was? A small breath slipped out of me before I even realized I said it. Weird. That was it. No fear, no snap of instinct, just confusion that faded as quickly as it came. I told myself I was tired, that the hike had been longer than I wanted to admit, that I was probably remembering it wrong. I picked up my pack again and stepped farther inside, letting the door drift halfway shut behind me. But even then, in that calm, ordinary moment, I couldn't shake the faint impression that the cabin wasn't as empty as it looked, not empty at all. A few hours earlier, everything still felt normal. Normal in the way December always feels. Cold sidewalks, crowded grocery stores, lights strung across porches that looked identical to last year, and the year before that, and the one before that, too. I remember thinking about that as I packed the last of my gear into the trunk. Christmas had turned into a checklist for me. Same dinners, same bars, same photos, same half-hearted conversations where we pretended the night felt different because of the date on the calendar. It never did. Not for me. But Zack, Mark, Jenna, and I had grown up together on the same street, 4 houses in a row, 4 families who never moved. So every holiday, every season, every year of our lives carried the same rhythm. Even when we grew older, moved into our own places, got our own jobs, the pattern stayed. We always looped back to the same traditions, the same routines. That was why I wanted something different this year, something that didn't feel recycled. A couple weeks earlier, I'd overheard 2 older guys at a hardware store talking about an abandoned cabin somewhere up in the Whites, like it was just another landmark people used to know about. They didn't describe it like a ghost story, more like an old thing the forest swallowed. The way they said it stuck with me longer than it should have. So I brought it up to the others. I didn't pitch it like an adventure or a dare. I just said maybe we could do Christmas somewhere quiet, somewhere without neon lights and bar music in the same predictable places. The idea landed easier than I expected. Zack liked the sound of a survival-style Christmas. Mark said he could use a weekend with no signal. Jenna just smiled and shrugged like she already knew she'd go. We planned it fast, too fast maybe. Packed basic gear, warm clothes, food, nothing fancy. The kind of stuff people bring when they're not trying to prove anything, just escape for a bit. The drive north was easy. Gray skies, open highway, pine trees sliding past the windows like long brushstrokes. Everyone was relaxed, laughing, taking turns choosing music. I didn't feel the weight in my chest that usually showed up this time of year. The trailhead was quiet when we arrived. No cars, no footprints, just a thin sheet of old snow clinging to the ground and a wind that shifted direction every few minutes, swirling one way, then another, like it couldn't decide what to do. Mark looked up once and said something under his breath about weather being out of rhythm today, which none of us paid attention. It was winter. Weather did weird things. We hiked for a couple of hours, not a strenuous climb, just steady uphill walking. The forest around us was dense but beautiful. Tall pines, bare branches, the sound of snow flaking off limbs and dropping somewhere out of sight. Every now and then, sunlight pushed through the canopy and hit the trail in long stripes. I remember thinking the woods felt calmer than usual. Not peaceful, not serene, just quiet. A little too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you stop mid-step and listen harder. But there was nothing to hear except our boots and our breath, so I let it go. Somewhere along the final stretch, the wind stopped altogether. No sound, no movement in the branches. The air settled in a way that made everything feel paused, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the mood or sound dramatic. We were having a good day. I wasn't going to ruin it by pointing out something as small as silence. We reached a narrow clearing as the sun began to lower behind the ridge. The trees opened just enough to reveal a slouched shape tucked between two heavy trunks. The cabin. It looked exactly like what I imagined when I overheard those men talking. Weather-beaten, faded, a little crooked. The kind of structure that shouldn't still be standing but somehow was. Zack grinned like he discovered buried treasure. Jenna took a slow look around at the tree line, like she was already imagining how cozy it would feel once we made it livable. Mark pushed the door lightly, testing its give. I dropped my pack to roll my shoulders out, feeling the relief of not carrying weight anymore. Nothing about the place scared me. Nothing about it felt wrong. It was just old, abandoned, forgettable. A blank space where the four of us could exist for a weekend without the world trying to pull us back into routine. We stepped inside and saw exactly what we expected. Dust, scattered debris, a few broken remnants of furniture. Nothing fresh, nothing moved, nothing strange. Just years of neglect sitting still in the air. We split up instinctively, Zack checking the corners, Mark figuring out which spots on the floor were stable, Jenna brushing aside leaves at the threshold, me shaking out a tarp near the doorway. Someone muttered a small line, one of the allowed micro-moments. I think it was Mark saying something like, "Not bad." Just a tiny acknowledgement that the place was workable. And it was. Simple, empty, perfect for what we thought we wanted. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, we started cleaning, unpacking, sorting gear, settling in. We didn't know it then, but that was the last truly ordinary hour we'd have. We'd been inside the cabin for less than an hour when Zack found the thing that changed the tone of the whole night. He'd been digging around in the far corner, kicking aside old boards and a shredded tarp, when he froze and leaned down with a curious little grunt. A second later, he lifted something upright, knocking dust off its shoulders. It was a wooden mannequin, not the kind you see in art classes. This one was almost the height of a real person, carved in a crude, simple way. Stiff limbs, blocky torso, no defined eyes or mouth, just a smooth, rounded head and joints held by old blackened screws. It looked handmade, old, abandoned for a reason. Zack set it on its feet and stepped back like he'd found a prize. I wanted to tell him to leave it alone, but the truth was I didn't care enough to argue. It was just wood, a forgotten prop in a forgotten cabin, nothing more. And then Zack got an idea. He tugged open a small drawer near the hearth and pulled out a red knit hat, frayed at the edges but still bright enough to pass as festive. He pressed it onto the mannequin's head. Then he found a torn piece of cloth, twisted it into a rough beard, and tied it around the blank chin. That alone made the thing look ridiculous, like a store decoration that had been left out in the rain for too many seasons. But he wasn't done. Propped against the wall near the hearth was a small axe. Its handle faded and cracked. Zack picked it up, tested the weight, and wedged the handle into the mannequin's rigid grip. The wooden fingers didn't actually close around it, but the axe stayed, awkward, crooked, but still held well enough. The whole thing was stupid. I remember thinking that exact word, stupid, but harmless, harmless enough to ignore. Night settled in faster than any of us expected. By the time we stepped outside to cook, the forest had swallowed the last streak of orange in the sky. We lit a small fire in the pit outside, set up the portable grill, and let the smoke drift upward into the dark. The cold hit sharper after the sun went down, the kind of cold that makes your breath feel heavier. We ate and talked in low voices. Nothing serious, just old stories, dumb jokes, the usual rhythm we fell into when we were together. Everything felt simple again for a moment. Then something shifted at the edge of the tree line. It was quick, so quick I wasn't sure I'd seen it. A dark shape moved between the pines, sliding from one trunk to another in a straight, smooth motion. Zack stiffened beside me. Jenna stopped mid-sentence. Mark lifted his head like he was listening for footsteps. No footsteps came, no breaking branches, no breathing, just silence swallowing itself again. None of us said a word about it. We didn't need to. Each of us had seen something, but none of us were confident enough to name it. We cleaned up dinner and brought our gear back inside before the cold could get worse. And right as the cabin door creaked open, something fell in the far corner with a dull clack. A piece of wood. The same piece all of us had moved out of the way earlier. It shouldn't have been sitting there again, not unless someone placed it back. Zack nudged it aside with his boot and laughed under his breath as if the sound alone made it less strange. We went about setting up the inside for the night. Lantern placed on the table, jackets hung by the door, sleeping pads unrolled along the floor. The air felt warmer in here, but only because it wasn't freezing like outside. The cabin's dim lantern light softened the rough edges of the place, made it feel smaller in a weirdly comforting way. That comfort didn't last. Zack walked past the mannequin and stopped. The axe was on the floor again. He bent down, picked it up, and pushed it back into the wooden hand. The grip seemed firm enough, and he stepped away with a satisfied nod. 2 minutes later, it dropped again. This time there was no noise of it slipping, no sound of impact that matched the angle. It was just on the ground, like someone had placed it gently there. I walked over, more curious than bothered, and picked it up myself. The handle felt dry and cold. When I turned to lift it back to the mannequin, something made my stomach tighten. The mannequin had a smile, a crooked, dragged-on smile that hadn't been there before. The wood itself was still smooth, unchanged, but across the blank face, someone had smeared a thin, uneven line of soot or dirt, too dark, too deliberate, curling upward at one corner like a half-formed grin. I stared at it for a long second before I spoke. Why? It slipped out without thinking, quiet, irritated, confused. Zack swore he didn't touch it. Jenna looked honestly unsettled. Mark shook his head immediately. I didn't push it. None of us were in the mood to start an argument over a stupid wooden face. But the room felt different after that. A little tighter, a little colder. We went outside again a few minutes later to gather more firewood before calling it a night. The cold bit into my fingers even through my gloves, and the flashlights cut thin paths through the dark. Snow crunched steadily under our boots. Then something moved behind the cabin. A shadow, low, fast, too fast to be a person. Zack spun around. Jenna lifted her light. Mark muttered something sharp under his breath. All three beams landed on nothing but trees. No movement, no footprints. The snow was untouched. We walked slowly back to the cabin, none of us eager to be the first to admit what we thought we saw. It wasn't that we were scared. Not yet. We just didn't have a good explanation, and saying it out loud would make the whole thing heavier. Inside, the lantern flickered once, then steadied. The air felt dense, not oppressive, just thick enough that every breath felt a little warmer when it left my chest. Another clack sounded from the back wall, the same piece of wood again. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't even been near anything that could move it, but there it was, right back in the exact spot where we first found it. Zack kicked it farther away this time, muttering something I couldn't hear. Jenna checked the windows, more out of habit than suspicion. Mark knelt to rearrange some of the scattered debris. Everyone moved in small, stiff motions like the night was starting to drag at us. My eyes drifted to the mannequin again. The smile looked darker in the lantern glow. Wider, maybe, like it had been drawn with more weight behind it. I told myself it only looked that way because of the shadows. Light does strange things in old cabins. Angles warp, edges shift, faces, even blank ones, take on shapes you don't expect. We stayed up a little longer, trying to shrug off the unease as nothing more than exhaustion. Long day, long hike, fading brains. It didn't help. Every few minutes one of us glanced toward the windows, or the door, or the corner where the mannequin stood. No one said they were uneasy. No one had to. The patterns were forming, even if we weren't ready to see them yet. The dark shape in the trees, the falling object that kept returning to the same place, the axe dropping over and over, the smile that hadn't been there the first time we looked. Little things, small things, things you can explain if you try hard enough. And all of us were trying very, very hard, because it was only the beginning. The forest, the cabin, the quiet, none of it had shown its teeth yet. It was still letting us believe we were safe, still letting us think this was all just harmless, stupid coincidence, still letting us pretend nothing was wrong. Not yet, not quite, but soon. Night thickened around the cabin in a way that didn't feel gradual. One moment the forest was simply dark, the next it was buried under a layer of pitch, like something had smothered the sky. The temperature dropped sharply, turning every breath into a cloud. Even inside the cabin, we could feel the cold pushing up through the floorboards. We tried to keep the fire outside alive, mostly because the faint glow eased the tension none of us wanted to name. But within minutes of relighting it, the flames shrank to a hiss. They didn't flicker, didn't sputter. They just died, like someone had pinched the air out of them. Mark crouched beside the pit and brushed the embers with a stick. They glowed for a second, then dulled again. "No way," he whispered, staring at the fuel. There was no wind, not even a hint of it. The smoke drifted slowly upward in a straight line before fading into nothing. We stepped back inside to warm up, but the heaviness followed us. The air felt collected, like the cabin was holding its breath. The lantern flickered for a moment, steadied, then dimmed again without the flame ever shrinking. Shadows moved along the walls even when none of us walked by them. Jenna was the first to say she needed a break from the tension. She stepped out to the open area in front of the cabin, just a few paces from the doorway. We could still see her clearly in the lantern's glow. She knelt to adjust her bootlaces, brushing off a patch of snow near the step. And that was when something pulled her downward. There was no wind, no branch, no animal, no sound of impact. Just a sudden, violent yank, like an invisible hand locked around her ankle and dragged her a full foot across the ground. Her knees hit the snow, her palms scraped ice. She gasped sharply, the noise cutting straight through the quiet. Jenna scrambled backward on her elbows, boot kicking at empty air. Mark rushed out. I followed. Zack hovered at the doorway, flashlight trembling. We circled her, scanning the ground for anything she might have tripped on, but the snow was untouched. Perfectly smooth, except for the trail her leg had carved. All she said was a small, tight line. Something pulled me. None of us argued. None of us pretended she imagined it. We backed into the cabin in a huddled formation. The moment Mark shut the door, something slammed against the back wall. Hard. A hollow, flat thud that shook dust loose from the rafters. The lantern stuttered again, then steadied. We froze for seconds that felt longer than they were. Zack whispered, "What was—" He cut himself off when another crash erupted from the loft above. Then another. Then the door rattled, each shake more violent than the last, like someone was pressing their entire weight against it without trying to break it, only to test it, to feel it move. A scraping sound dragged itself along the outside wall, slow, deliberate, the way someone would drag the back of their hand along old wood. I don't know who noticed the mannequin first. Maybe all of us did at the same time, because one moment it was standing where Zack left it, by the far wall near the hearth, and in the next it simply wasn't. No noise, no footsteps, no shift of weight. It was just gone from that spot, like we'd imagined leaving it there. Jenna swallowed hard. Mark's breathing quickened in shallow bursts. Zack stepped backward until he hit the corner of the room, flashlight jerking upward with his movement. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. A kind of recognition that whatever was happening around us had stepped over a line. The harmless weirdness of earlier was gone. This was something else. I didn't want to go outside again, but I didn't want to stay inside either. The door rattled a final time, then stopped. The quiet after it was worse than the noise. We moved together, inching toward the opening. Zack pulled the latch slowly, the metal scraping loud in the silence. A cold gust pushed inward the second he cracked the door. We stepped outside, flashlights sweeping the darkness. In the trees to our right, something cut across the tree line in one smooth motion. Too clean, too silent, like the dark itself had shifted. I turned my light toward it, but the beam hit only branches, snow, and layers of dark that seemed deeper than before. I heard Mark whisper, "What the hell?" But he didn't finish, because at the tree line, maybe 15 yards away, something stood perfectly still. A silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a shape that resembled the outline of a coat, a hat, something like a sack slung over one shoulder, all carved in shadow. The lantern light spilling from the cabin caught just enough detail to imprint one horrifying truth into my mind. It looked like the mannequin. It looked like the Santa Zack had made, except it wasn't wood, and it wasn't standing where we left it. No one spoke. The forest didn't breathe. The cold didn't move. We stared at it for what felt like a full minute. It stayed still, not swaying, not shifting weight, not reacting, just watching, or facing us at least. I couldn't tell if it had eyes. My flashlight slipped slightly in my hand as I adjusted my grip, and in that half second, The moment my beam left it, it was closer. Not walking, not lunging, just closer. 5 yards closer, as if space had changed around it. Jenna let out the smallest, sharpest breath. Zack muttered, "No." Under his breath, I stepped backward, and something in me snapped. A single word left my mouth before I could think. Run. Not loud, not shouted, just a raw command. We scattered, not in different directions, but in a broken, stumbling line, down what looked like the trail. Flashlights swung wildly, beams bouncing, cutting across trunks that looked identical in every direction. Snow kicked up around our legs, branches whipped across our clothes. Behind us, I heard the faintest sound, not footsteps, not breathing, more like something slipping through the branches in one long, smooth motion. My heart slammed into my ribs. My lungs felt too cold to work. Zack surged ahead of us, panicked instinct taking over. Jenna stumbled and Mark grabbed her arm before she fell again. I kept shouting the same word inside my skull over and over, not sure if my mouth was moving anymore. The trail curved. Or maybe we did. The trees blurred past in walls of black. Every time one of us turned our flashlight behind us, the beam caught nothing, but the sense of something close stayed with us, pressing at our backs. At one point, Jenna gasped and pointed left. Light! Not a full sentence, not even a thought, just instinct. A small glow flickered between the trees, dim, steady, artificial, hope, a cabin light, a ranger station, something human. We ran toward it with everything we had left. Branches snagged at our jackets, roots caught our boots. My legs were shaking so hard I thought I'd collapse before we reached the clearing. The light grew brighter as we got closer, warm, golden, alive. We broke through the trees, lungs burning, snow spraying outward, and nearly fell to our knees at what we saw. It wasn't a ranger station. It wasn't help. It wasn't anything new. It was the same cabin, our cabin. The lantern was still glowing on the table inside. None of us understood how we'd circled back. None of us wanted to. We regrouped at the doorway, panting, trembling, waiting for Zack to catch up from behind. But Zack didn't appear. Jenna called his name once before Mark squeezed her shoulder, shaking his head. The forest behind us stayed silent, the kind of silence that holds its breath. We slammed the door shut and dropped the latch. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than before, too warm, like the walls were trapping our body heat, too quiet, too watchful. The mannequin wasn't in the cabin, the axe wasn't either, and the smile I'd seen earlier felt like it was carved into the air itself, even though I couldn't see it anywhere. We huddled together in the center of the room, barely speaking, barely moving, every breath shallow and controlled. The lantern cast long, trembling shadows on the walls, stretching and bending with the slightest motion. Outside, something shifted across the snow with slow, steady rhythm, not approaching, not leaving, just circling, waiting. We didn't dare open the door again. We didn't dare look out the window. For the first time since arriving, none of us pretended we knew what was happening. The night had stopped being weird. It had become something else entirely, and whatever stood beyond the trees wasn't finished with us, not even close. The minutes after we barricaded ourselves inside didn't feel like minutes. They felt stretched, pulled thin, heavy with the kind of silence that presses on your ears until your own heartbeat becomes the loudest thing in the room. None of us spoke at first. None of us had the breath for it. We just stood there, backs close, eyes dart into every corner the lantern didn't fully reach. The cabin looked different now. Smaller, darker, older. The shadows clung to the edges of the room like something waiting to step forward. The boards under our boots creaked even when we didn't move, like the wood itself was adjusting to something unseen shifting around us. Mark finally lowered himself to the floor, breathing through clenched teeth. Jenna stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. The lantern gave another weak flicker, dimming for a second before recovering. "It's okay," I heard myself say, though my voice wasn't steady. I didn't believe what I said, and I knew neither of them did either. We waited for Zack to appear, any sound, any movement, any sign of him, but nothing came from the forest. Only that muted drag across the snow, the same sound we'd heard circling before. Slow, intentional, like it was pacing, measuring, tracking a perimeter. My stomach sank. A perimeter. The idea came quietly at first, like a stray thought I shouldn't hold on to. But the longer the sound continued, that lazy looping trail around the walls, the more impossible it became to ignore. I moved toward the window and pressed my ear against the wood beside it. Mark shot me a look that said not to do anything stupid, but I stayed there anyway. The footsteps weren't random. They weren't wandering. They moved in a perfect loop, a slow orbit around the cabin, never crossing a certain distance, never straying far, just circling. It hit me then, the first piece of something that made too much sense. "We didn't get lost," I whispered. "It kept us here." Mark stiffened. Jenna lifted her chin just slightly, eyes wide. I pulled in a cold breath that felt too deep for my lungs. "We didn't run in a circle. It made us come back." None of them contradicted me, because deep down, all three of us already knew the trail hadn't looped. We hadn't taken a wrong turn. We fled in a straight line. The forest had changed around us. It had pushed us back like we were attached to the cabin on a tether. The footsteps outside didn't rush or stumble. They came in a slow, patient rhythm, like someone taking their time as they circled the cabin, never hurrying, never stopping. Something brushed against the outer wall, soft enough that it could have been fabric, or wood, or something else pretending to be one of those things. I backed away from the window. We needed a plan. We needed some kind of logic, any logic, to hold on to, even if it wasn't complete. While the others tried to warm their hands near the lantern, I replayed everything we'd seen since sunset, the blurred figure between the trees, the axe dropping every time we looked away, the smile appearing when no one watched, the mannequin disappearing only when none of us were facing it. I felt a cold realization form slowly, piece by piece. "It only moves when we're not looking," I said quietly. Neither of them reacted right away. The idea was too simple, too childish, like a rule from a children's game. But the longer it sat in the air, the more wrong it felt, and the more true. Jenna finally whispered, "Are you sure?" I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. When we stared at it by the tree line, it froze, exactly where it stood. The moment we blinked, it jumped. Even saying it out loud made my stomach twist. Mark rubbed a shaking hand across his mouth. "So we just don't look away?" "That's not enough," I said. "It's not trying to sneak up on us. It's trying to keep us here." The lantern dimmed again, shrinking to a trembling pin of warmth. A gust of cold leaked from the loft above us, a draft that hadn't existed earlier. Tiny grains of snow drifted down from the rafters, falling in slow spirals that melted before they reached the floor. Something was moving up there, or shifting weight, or brushing against the roof. Jenna stepped closer to us. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Why is it doing this?" I didn't have an answer, not one I was willing to say. But the truth was circling the same way the footsteps outside circled the cabin, always close, never fully stepping forward. A thought surfaced in my mind, unwanted, clear. This wasn't about killing us, at least not immediately. This was about something else, something slower, more deliberate. A line left my mouth before I could stop it. The one revelation the night had been pushing me toward, spoken with no emotion because I had none left to give. "It wants us aware." Jenna went still. Mark stared at the floor. None of us asked what that meant, because it didn't feel like a threat in the way danger usually does. It felt like instruction, like a rule we were being forced to learn. Snow scraped softly across the roof, then silence, then another slow drag behind the back wall. We needed a plan, something more than just listening to it circle us until sunrise. I turned off my flashlight. Maybe it reacts to the light. Mark shook his head. Or maybe it reacts when we move. We all stood motionless for several seconds, barely breathing. Nothing happened. Then the footsteps circled again. Not faster, not slower, just steady. Always steady. "We have to make it to morning," I said. "That's it. Just survive until then." No one objected. No one had a better idea. Phone signal never returned while the night held us. The cold sank deeper into our bones, creeping up through the floorboards and settling behind our ribs. Every minute stretched itself out, long and thin. Every sound made us flinch. Every shift of the lantern flame pulled our eyes in multiple directions, afraid to blink, afraid not to. At one point, Jenna swayed on her feet, exhausted. Mark caught her by the arm before she fell. I told them both to sit, even though I couldn't force myself to join them. The moment I sat down, I knew I'd lose my attention, my focus, my watchfulness. So I stood near the center of the room, staring at the door, afraid to look anywhere else, afraid not to. The pattern outside kept looping in the same unsettling rhythm. A heavy step in the snow, a stretch of silence, a faint drag along the wall, another pause, then the step again. Always returning, always the same, never coming closer, never leaving. As if the thing out there didn't care about the cabin at all, only the boundary around it. Hours passed, or something like hours. The lantern dimmed so much I could barely see my own hand. My legs shook from standing so long. My eyes burned from not blinking. Every breath felt like swallowing ice. At some point, snow began drifting through the cracks in the roof in a steady stream, collecting in a small white mound near the table. I brushed some off my boot and realized the flakes weren't falling. They were being dislodged by something moving above us. I stared at the ceiling, waited for it to shift again, waited to see a shape between the gaps. It didn't appear, but the boards creaked twice, then settled. Jenna whispered, "Don't look." Not an instruction, just fear spilling out in a half-formed thought. None of us moved. Time dragged itself forward the way a wounded animal tries to crawl, slow, pained, determined. I kept counting my breaths in sets of 10 just to hold on to something. Each time I finished a cycle, I expected the footsteps to stop or start again. They kept doing both, in the rhythm we'd learned to anticipate. The entity outside never tried breaking in, never growled, never spoke, never revealed itself fully. It only circled, always circling, guarding something we couldn't see or understand. By the time the dark outside softened, not fully, not bright, but pale enough to shift the edges of the trees, my knees felt like they'd give out. My eyes stung with tears that weren't from emotion, only exhaustion. Mark lifted his head first. "It's lighter." Jenna straightened slowly. "Is it morning?" I didn't answer, but the footsteps had stopped for the first time, and that silence felt worse than anything the night had given us. We weren't safe, but we had a direction again. Morning meant signal, signal meant help, and help meant surviving long enough to reach it. Just before dawn, everything went silent. It didn't fade out slowly the way night usually lifts. It stopped, all at once. The cold, the circling, the pressure against the walls, everything vanished in a single breath, like the whole forest had gone still in one sudden drop. We didn't move at first. None of us trusted it. The lantern was barely alive by then, a weak orange ember trembling on the table. Mark's hands were shaking from exhaustion. Jenna's lips were blue. My legs felt locked in place, stiff from standing too long, watching too long, thinking too long. But the silence held, and the dim gray outside the windows finally told us morning had arrived. I unlatched the door with fingers that didn't feel like mine. When I pushed it open, cold air rushed in, sharper than anything from the night before. The forest stood still, pale, indifferent. Snow clung to the branches in soft curls. Nothing moved. At first, I didn't see it. Then Jenna stepped forward, and her breath caught. A small box sat in the snow a few feet from the threshold, wrapped in faded red paper, tied with a single green ribbon, the kind of wrapping people use for last-minute gifts, simple and hurried. I thought maybe it was a joke, a leftover decoration from whoever abandoned the cabin years ago, something meaningless. But when Mark picked it up, the bottom was wet. Inside was Zack's scarf, the dark wool one he'd worn the entire hike, the one his mother knitted for him last Christmas. It was stiff with dried blood, frozen into dark, rigid folds. I don't remember much after that, just the sound Jenna made, not loud, not even a cry, just something small and broken in the way Mark had to sit down in the doorway because his legs gave out. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A signal. Weak, but real. I didn't think. I just dialed for help. The rescue team reached us before the sun climbed fully over the ridge. They checked the cabin, the clearing, the trail, the woods for a full mile in every direction. They found no tracks besides our own, no sign of a struggle, no sign of Zack. They didn't find the mannequin either. I didn't argue with them when they said it was possible Zack wandered off in the dark. People panic, people get turned around, people vanish in forests all the time. But I knew better. We all did. When I got home, I slept for 10 hours straight and woke up more tired than before. The days that followed felt wrong, too bright, too normal. I kept catching myself looking out the window every time the yard went quiet. And some nights, especially the windless ones, I'd see something standing at the far edge of the property, perfectly still. Too tall for the fence posts, too broad for a tree, never moving, never approaching, just watching. This morning, when I opened my front door to get the mail, something rolled gently against my shoe. A small, familiar shape sitting on the welcome mat, the same brass bell I'd seen on the cabin window ledge. Not dusty, not weathered, not old, just clean. Placed there carefully. I didn't pick it up. I closed the door instead. And I've been listening ever since, waiting for the moment the quiet around the house stops feeling like quiet at all.